Well, all right, my friends, let's do this. My name is David Parsons, and you are listening to Nostalgia Trap. I thank you for joining me, and I hope you enjoy what we've got for you today. We're talking about food, the culture of food, the politics of food, and the history of all of that stuff in the United States. My guest today is Xaq Frohlich. He is an associate professor of the history of technology at Auburn University and the author of a book called From Label to Table: Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. And I have to say, this book and the conversation that I had with Xaq that you're about to hear totally blew my mind and rearranged a lot of what I thought about how food has worked in the United States. And that it's a long history and it's a wide set of ideas. And I come from Southern California, a lot of vegetarians, a lot of hippies, a lot of environmentalism, and those kinds of concerns within a larger bourgeois liberal food culture. I always associated being concerned with food as a kind of left thing. And there is just such a bigger set of ideas at play here. And I think that what Xaq brings to us is a way of understanding the success of RFK Jr. and the Make America Healthy Again, MAHA Moms, that have sort of taken over the food conversation in a lot of ways. There is so much going on here, and what I really appreciate about Xaq's work is how it sits at the intersection of talking about capitalism and material economies and science, but also culture and our sort of felt experience. I love all of that stuff. If you've listened to Nostalgia Trap over the years, you know that. But I really appreciated this conversation. I hope you learn as much from it as I did. Check out all of our Nostalgia Trap stuff on our Patreon page. The link is in the episode description. Really appreciate the people who subscribe and support the show and access all of our bonus episodes, our news trap stuff, and our newest feature, Screenshots, where I'm sharing all of the raw feed of news stories that drive me and Justin Rogers Cooper crazy as we're planning out stuff to talk about on this show. So thanks so much for being a listener and enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Xaq Frohlich. Xaq Frohlich, thank you for joining me. Welcome to Nostalgia Trap. How are you?
I'm doing fine. It's a pleasure to be here.
You have a book. I want to say the name of it before we even get started so people can pick it up and check it out. It's called From Label to Table: Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. Very prescient topics here. You do like sort of I love your approach. It's sort of a, would you call it interdisciplinary, sort of history of science, somewhere in there?
Yeah, I come out of the background in history of science, but what interested me in this book is thinking about different kinds of experts. And so I like to look at science experts, but also legal and market experts. And so it really is a kind of bringing of these different communities of people who are thinking about food together.
What I love about the idea for your book is that I saw it described, and I think you described it as a biography of the food label. And you're taking just this piece of our everyday reality, which is that nutrition facts, black and white label that's on all of our food, and finding that it's sort of like a portal into a whole world of scientific and political and cultural ideas and policy fights. I had no idea the history of the food label at all. When did we start putting labels on food?
Oh, great question. Look, I actually had no idea either. I never really read food labels before this project. And one day I was looking at the nutrition facts label. A friend of mine, sort of who is not American, looked at it and said, "This is just weird," because back then they didn't have them in Europe. And it got me thinking, like, where did this thing come from? And I kind of had an intuition that it had a kind of legal background and a science background. And so that was what got me interested in sort of looking into it. And initially, I learned, what you usually hear with the nutrition facts label is it was introduced in the 1990s. Um, and so I kind of, when I first started researching and writing about it, I was writing a story of the kind of 1990s. Um, we had this legislation, the Nutrition Labeling Education Act. This sort of required the Food and Drug Administration to put in a universal mandatory um, label, and they designed this new thing with this really iconic design change.
Mm.
And that was sort of a simple story. But as I started digging into it, I discovered that no, this label was actually meant to be an answer to a bunch of different kinds of concerns that went back decades. And so um, the story I tell in this book starts in the 1930s. Labeling food is older than that. And in a way, the interest in labeling food is really the story of the rise of packaged foods, where you no longer have that, you know, uh, unmediated relationship between sort of the food as a thing you can look at and assess, and the person selling it and the buyer sort of saying, I can kind of evaluate this food, or I can ask the seller. And increasingly, packaged food become more important. And so, first companies, and then local, and then finally federal government people start saying we need to put information on this label so consumers can figure out what they're buying.
That's funny because it makes me think about, I mean, I teach American history and then the survey of US history. And oftentimes, when you're talking about like the FDA and food labeling and things like that, it's all like, the jungle and Upton Sinclair and the meat packing industry in the late 19th and early 20th century. But it makes me think about just in our lifetime, just in the last like I don't know, 10 or 15 years, there have been a lot of like food documentaries, a lot of food politics. Do you remember Food Inc? Do you remember that when that was popular?
Absolutely.
Like I was showing,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, I remember showing bits of that in classes and being like, "Look, you need to know this." And the sort of idea, the main idea, if I remember, one of them is that became very commonplace, is that well, we're separated from our food in a lot of ways. Like where it's produced, how it's produced, is very geographically and in many other ways far away from us, and we need to know what's in it. But the labeling thing, I kind of wonder, like, what are the impulses behind labeling it? Because a lot of it is just it's under the guise of nutrition, right? Like it's like sort of like,
Yeah.
well, what? I mean, I don't know how many people actually read these labels, but it seems like a lot of people do.
Yeah. So this we are in a moment of substantial interest in food, and also a lot of concern and anxiety about this kind of industrial foodway. And
Yeah.
this is actually a kind of perennial concern. There are these cycles of this. When I start my story in the 1930s, you see a lot of anxieties about the kind of ascendance of nationally branded foods. There's this kind of battle of just and proliferation of packaged foods, and people are saying this is confusing. You have consumer experts, home economists writing saying we need to simplify this. And at that time, they saw two answers to the question. One was information. They said we need better information, but they really believed that unless we had food standards to kind of reduce the clutter of confusing, misleading, a lot of deceptive,
Hmm.
cheap imitations. They're like, without food standards, information be kind of worthless. So the kind of home economists who are progressive and advocating for reform push both, and we only end up getting one. And so my story starts with the rise of the FDA's food standards, where the FDA basically said, for mass-produced foods, we're going to require you to follow these broad general recipes. They use the analogy of recipes with set ingredients, and that these will be kind of set minimum standards that then companies can adapt to. Um, Interestingly, they
Mm.
actually initially don't want health labeling on these products because they're also trying to define what are drug products. And so they see foods as being like, with the standards, they would be intuitive and obvious, and you don't want to confuse people with health information. That falls apart after World War II because you start to get the rise of a huge interest in health foods. First
Mm.
with vitamin enriched foods, then with artificially sweetened foods, and then um, in the 60s you have what was called the cholesterol controversy. People start getting concerned about having preventative diets to prevent future heart disease by lowering your fats in your diet. So all of these health foods start creating a real interest in what would become nutrition labeling, and that really gets first introduced in the 1970s. So you have this big
Wow. Yeah.
shift in the 1970s away from sort of food is food, but drugs are special and regulated to this new idea that no, we're going to have health foods and we're going to have nutrition labeling, which is more the world we know today.
Yeah, it's funny because you bring up the 60s and 70s, and immediately I'm thinking about like hippies and the counterculture and vegetarians and the sort of movement to like recognize that the food supply was dangerous in some way, or like they quote unquote like a mainstream food processing industry was out to poison you. And it seems like that it seems like that's more than just hippies now. It seems like a lot of people embrace the idea that the food industry is nefarious in some way and trying to hide what they're putting in the food from us. Does that make sense?
Yes, and there's a kind
And
of
is it
interesting,
true?
well, sort of, yes and no. So there has always been on both the right and the left a lot of criticisms about the food industry and especially the Food and Drug Administration.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that happens in the 1960s is you have this odd alliance on both sides. On the left, you have this anger with the FDA, which is seen to be sort of uh, it's sort of establishment in the sense that they're ignoring a lot of concerns about new chemicals that are showing up in foods. They're also the FDA is wrapped up in a lot of drug risk controversies, in particular the birth control pill. You wouldn't think of birth control pill when you think of food, but people are finding risk with the birth control pill. But then feminists are saying we don't want doctors and the FDA telling us what to do with that, and so the FDA says, okay,
Oh,
fine,
wow.
we'll put patient information inserts for the first time into these into with these medications, with these prescription drugs, with the idea that patients, not just the doctor, are now making these kinds of decisions. In a similar way, they kind of come to the same conclusion with food, which is okay, you have lots of lifestyle concerns. We're no longer going to police these questions about diet and health. Instead, we're going to encourage labeling and then also encourage companies to sort of innovate healthier foods for that to accommodate this kind of um, what scholars at the time were calling the me generation, this idea of like we don't want you to tell us what to do because we have our own life. And so that's a kind of alignment. The left is doing this. On the right, they're saying the same thing with, we don't like the FDA telling businesses, what they do, get rid of this unnecessary regulation. And so there's a kind of moment in the late 60s and early 70s where, which is kind of familiar if you're looking today, where
Totally.
all
Yeah.
sides are saying, don't tell us what to eat. And we don't trust you for different reasons.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it really feels like, American freedom, a very particular idea of libertarian freedom that's embraced on both the left and the right, and that the regulators are really a very specific group in the middle. I'm not sure where they occupy, these government regulators, but it seems like there is, yeah. I mean, there is an idea of putting by you choosing to address public health through labels. You're doing a sort of like caveat emptor thing where you're sort of like, well,
Mhm.
it's up to you. We gave you all the information. The labels, it reminds me of cigarettes a little bit, where it's like,
Absolutely.
just
And this is the appeal. So on the one hand, you have the appeal of a kind of older, traditional, uh, pro-market person who's like, it is caveat emptor. You can assume the risks with the information, and therefore we'll put it out there, and we won't be, banning ingredients. Instead, we'll say this is the information. You can make the decision yourself. On the other hand, it appeals to the left as well because it's this idea that information is power, knowledge is power. We're empowering the consumer. And so it's this weird meeting point where both the left and the right are always in favor of these kind of labeling initiatives. One of the criticisms I have in this book is that you have to be careful. Often they come at the expense of other forms of regulation. And so in the book, I'm quite critical of this, read the label approach, because
mm,
I argue that we actually do depend on these expert communities. Even when we have these information labels, what goes on the label, how it's framed, how it's sort of the layout and design, everything is being determined by these expert communities, and you just can't escape that.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a dodge in some way by a food industry that could get away with a lot just by saying, well, the label is it's on the label, so that's that. And it seems like it, and this is something you I think discuss in your book, which is, well, it's not all on the label, right? Like there's a fight over what exactly goes on there. I'll say with this, when I read the labels, I'm looking for, because I'm in my 40s, I'm looking at sugars, I'm looking at
Mhm.
fats, I'm looking at stuff like that. I'm not thinking about necessarily some of the other things that are in food that might be a danger to me. And it's sort of, I don't know, it sort of like puts on the consumer that we're supposed to be experts in this stuff that not everyone is.
Yeah, no, that you repeatedly throughout when you have FDA officials, but also others promoting the idea of the label, you'll hear them make these kinds of statements like, "Now we can all be experts because we have this sort of information tool." And the title of the book or the subtitle of the book, "In the Information Age," is trying to speak to this moment we live in where there is this flood of information sources. And one of the things that we have is this idea that, us, the individual, can go out, seek out the information and be empowered. And kind of the challenge I raised in this book that I got thinking about with the food label is actually that's really uh, a really problematic approach to a lot of public policy concerns, particularly with health,
Yeah,
where people are very vulnerable and susceptible to the kinds of misinformation or disinformation campaigns. We really aren't doctors,
right.
and so it's like putting all that different information into context and making decisions on this thing that can be really important to us is really difficult for the consumer.
Yeah, and even though we're not all doctors, it feels like there are a lot of people consuming like doctor influencers, that aren't doctors, people that are on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, who are like talking about all of a sudden they're talking about mRNA vaccine stuff they just heard on Joe Rogan or something.
Yeah,
And it's sort of like, yeah, if you're putting it all on the consumer to know what's going on, that seems even more impossible in what you call the information age, this sort of like I don't know, unending stream of bullshit you see on the internet and stuff that's kind of like I don't know what to think when I see a lot of that stuff. I mean, I was just reading today that there's a trend online. It's part of the Make America Healthy Again thing, which I want to talk about with
yeah,
you. But like,
yeah,
yeah, people like saying there's a trend that's like anxiety can be addressed by eating oranges in the shower, and this has become like and I'm like, well, is there science to that? Is that
yeah.
real? But it's embraced by lots and lots of people, and these videos are getting millions of likes and views and things like that, and it sort of seems like the label almost gets lost in all of that other
Yeah.
information. Yeah.
Well, and here's where being a historian of these kinds of health food markets is fun.
Yes.
It's really easy to look at the like second half of the 20th century, um, and you see this kind of battle of establishment institutions. And I have the Food and Drug Administration, but they have a kind of alliance with the American Medical Association, where what they're trying to do is they're in this battle of there are these crazy people out there. They literally talk about them as quacks, like quackery in the
Mm-hmm.
1950s, who are peddling all kinds of inappropriate things. And we're going to hold the line about what is serious medication, serious health advice, by having these kind of clear rules about what you can advertise about food or what you can say about drugs. And so that's the kind of it's easy walking into this world to sort of see that story of the establishment, and then you have these kind of quacks out there who are anti-establishment. If you take a longer history of it, though, it gets more complicated. And there has always been interest in food as the kind of way one handles diet.
Mm.
So actually, one of the things that I think about, not as much in the book as I have in another article, but um, is how you have this moment in the 1800s where food and drugs are all part of health, and you have like what are called patent drugs, some of which are basically just like souped up syrups or olive oil or things like that today we would think of as more like food. Um, because
Mm.
there was a
Mm-hmm.
recognition that your diet was really key to your health. And then there's this turning point in the beginning of the 20th century where the American Medical Association says, no, we have real drugs here, real pharmaceutical drugs, and we need to find a way to distinguish them from all of this other stuff. And so they start like 100 years campaign or war against these communities in alliance with the Food and Drug Administration. Um,
That is
and when you look at it in
fascinating.
that,
Wow.
when you look
Yeah.
in that light, the 1980s is really interesting because that's a moment where both organizations start pulling back. They start saying, okay, some of these alternative medicines may have value. Um, and and so there's a kind, it gets more complicated, that story, right at a moment when you start to get functional foods, which are these new kinds of foods with health properties. You have this huge marketing campaign around sort of old and new foods in terms of health. So all of which is to say that there has been this kind of long battle. It's what historians of medicine called mixed markets for health.
Yeah.
Right? There's many different kinds of health authorities out there, and the physician is one in combination with these other people out there who are, trying to sell you diet solutions. What I think is interesting about that is how they sell their authority. Physicians say, I'm credentialed, I've done research, or I'm backed by the institutions that do research. This is the FDA's idea. For all drugs, we're going to have pre-market testing for safety and risk, and we're going to have an assessment. People who are more like those influencers, often it's kind of based on personal charisma or like, hey, this worked for me, and therefore it
Yeah.
worked for you.
Right.
Or they might kind
Anecdotal
of
evidence. Yeah.
anecdotal evidence, or they might do it on kind of common sense, or sort of conventional knowledge. We all sort of know this to be true. And so that's
The
kind of like this.
herbalists. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like you kind of know this is going to be true because intuitively it makes sense. And it makes sense to me, therefore it should make sense to you.
And it seems like I can be convinced in a lot of different ways by pieces of these ideologies on either side. That's what makes it hard. And it felt like that, through the course of the pandemic, especially, and the sort of fight over vaccines, there became a
Mm.
thing that, I saw a lot of, because I live in kind of a Southern California where you get a mix of MAGA people and like very liberal, sort of hippie, good earth type people. And
Yeah.
there are a lot of people with signs outside their house that say like, we don't discriminate here, immigrants welcome, that sort of thing, those sort of signs. And one of the things that came to be on those signs during the pandemic was, in this house we believe in science, right? And like
Uh-huh.
there's
Yeah.
this sort of like, and I was sort of like, what does that really mean though? Because part of me is kind of like, what you're saying is that science is a fight,
Well,
and it is embedded with a certain kind of authority.
yeah, I've been thinking a lot about the Make America Healthy Again movement as a kind of a non-written, it's not in my book, obviously, because it came after, but I could see it as a kind of like, you know, uh, postscript. And I've been trying to think about how to make sense of it. And for me, there's kind of like three different strands, that I do talk about in the book that kind of help make sense of these sort of MAHA moms. And
Yes.
one is there is a lot of mom and housewife activism in the kind of food politics. But what's interesting is that, until the 1970s, a lot of it really is on the left. So you have figures like, there's this woman, Ruth Desmond, who creates what is called the Federation of Homemakers. She's very active in the food standards hearings in the 1950s and 1960s. Um, and her big thing is basically saying, hey, I am a housewife, and I'm going to hold you, the industry, and the FDA to sort of high standards of what that means. So when you're talking about peanut butter, for example, I want to make sure it has lots of peanuts. And she's just very colorful, and so she gets quoted a lot in the newspaper. She says any peanut butter that has less than 95% peanuts is could just be cold cream, and they love this, and they kind of quote these kinds of statements. Um, you also have, sort of these activist housewives who get involved in a lot of boycotts, and boycotts in different moments. Historian Emily Twarog has written about this in a really kind of great way. One of the things that is weird though that happens is up until the 1960s, these are kind of a core interest group for a lot of the food politics, um, in favor of strong regulation, in favor of the idea of the Food and Drug Administration as a protector of consumers. Um, by the 1970s, that kind of dies out. And a bunch of historians sort of argue that you have this moment where, in a way, feminists are promoting the idea of the working woman and trying to get away from this kind of traditional role of the woman. And in doing so, they cede that role to the right,
Mm.
and it loses a lot of its kind of teeth in terms of activism. So from the 1970s forward, when I'm thinking about who's showing up to the debates about sort of food policy from the left, it's organizations like Center for Science and Public Interest. It's this kind of biomedical public health group. They're not really framing it around sort of domestic concerns. And it's the right that now is saying family values. There's a family crisis. We need to sort of return to the meal. And maybe they're also including this idea that like the housewife is the kind of core of sort of nurturing and good food.
That is
So there's a kind of
amazing. Wow. Yeah.
that's a switch that's happening. A
That's
second
the
strand for
confluence of
me.
MAHA moms and trad wives, right?
No,
It's,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. The discussion about trad wives is a kind of really good example of this, where they're kind of hitting a nerve for feminists. Because on the one hand, feminists in the 1970s, 1980s were saying, "Hey, we should be working women. We're have all this invisible labor." Uh, in a way, convenience foods are liberating, right? Because it outsources the work of cooking to sort of factories. So this is
Mm.
great for the working mom. On the other hand, you're supposed to be empowering women to sort of do what they want to do. And if some women want to work at home, like they want to sort of, they see that work as valuable and in particular, taking care of their kids. So feminists are sort of struggling with this. And the trad wife is kind of like the perfect challenge. Like, are these sort of leading us away from kind of the liberation of women? Or are they somehow, ennobling women's work is kind of this sort of challenge that they raise. I
Wow.
think a second.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah,
well,
go
I mean,
ahead.
I was
I'm
going to
just, I'm
say,
just,
I
I'm
think,
just marveling at that thought because it's sort of like a reaction to feminism ends up changing the way people are thinking about food. And there are sort of like inadvertent and weird sort of, I don't know, cul-de-sacs of history that you don't expect. And that one I had never really considered before, but it makes so much sense.
I think for several decades now, food studies scholars have struggled with this question because on the one hand, you'll see them pushing forward like what's called the slow food movement, where it's about sort of cooking your own foods, sourcing locally, and all this. That takes a lot of work.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is ultimately something only a privileged person can do. And whether that privilege is like a full-time housewife, which is one kind of privilege, or whether that's sort of someone who's got the resources and time on their weekends and their evenings because they have a good job, it's a privileged thing. And so there's kind of this struggle with how do we, on the one hand, recognize that this kind of older way of making food is a kind of knowledge and it's valuable and it's also probably healthier and all these kinds of good things. On the other hand, it's work, it's difficult for a lot of people, it's not fun, and so pretending like it's supposed to be fun when it's not for them is just not, is not is not great.
Yeah. Who has the time to make healthy food?
Yeah. Well, a second strand that I also see in the Maha movement is this idea about sort of the concern about chemicals. And
Yeah.
this one, I will say, it looks new, but it's actually pretty old.
Mm.
You have like these periods of anxiety where the public, I think there's a kind of continuous anxiety, but there are these periods where that surfaces into national politics. And in the 1950s, you have anti-fluoride movements. So it's really amazing to see that happening right now because you can see these in the 1950s, the same thing where people are saying, why are we putting this chemical into our water? My favorite example of this is in the movie Dr. Strangelove.
Yes.
There's a scene with the general where he's talking about our bodily fluids and he's like talking this paranoia level. And that's the filmmakers were parroting this anti-fluoride anxiety with this character of the general, right? This kind of paranoia of this modern public health initiative that could sort of secretly be destroying us. Um, but you also have legislation with in the food additives amendment, it has a clause called the Delaney clause where it basically has zero tolerance for carcinogens in
Mm.
foods. So that's a big deal. Like for the next 3 decades, the FDA is constantly having to assess, like if a new study shows that this might cause cancer, do we have to ban it? And even in 1969, they actually do ban cyclamate as a sort of one of the two artificial sweeteners, and it creates this huge mess where people are like, "I like my cyclamate. Should the FDA be banning this?"
Well, yeah,
It stays banned, but it causes the FDA in the future to hesitate about the idea of banning.
It's sort of amazing how popular all of these things that were often fringe sort of movements about food became. Because I remember the health food stores in my town that were like
Hmm.
little hippie stores here and there, and then now we have Whole Foods Market, which is sort of like that idea of Whole Foods, which they still have a lot of processed food there, it seems like. But the thing that sticks out to me is like people like Michael Pollan, very
Hmm.
influential guy. I remember something that stuck out of all the things I read from him. The thing that stuck in my head was he was like, shop on the outside of the grocery store, the perimeter
Hmm.
of it. That's where all the like
Yeah.
Whole Foods are, and everything in the center of the grocery store. That's such a great like idea and meme that he got out there. But it seems like that idea has become it's in a kind of political culture that goes in a million different directions, if that makes sense. And it's so mainstream now. It's not as like seems it's not like a special knowledge anymore. It seems like everybody knows that processed food is something they should stay away from, and yet we're still stuck in it.
Yeah, I think some of the Whole Foods story, and even Michael Pollan is about kind of the mainstreaming of organic and the mainstreaming of this kind of
Yes.
idea of wholesome foods, a return to these sort of pre-industrial foods that would be better.
Right.
Um, there's all these kinds of ironies and paradoxes of that. I will admit, I'm worried about doing this on a sort of public venue, but I am I find Michael Pollan very frustrating.
Yeah.
On the
Yeah.
one hand, he writes very well. In a way, he explains really complicated ideas about food and food ways, better than I could. But I remember hearing him talk, and he's really preaching to the choir. Like
Mm.
he's got all of this privileged position where he can say we need to like only have these wholesome, healthy foods. Um, he also has this statement where he says you should only eat. I forget if it's like what my grandmother or my grandmother's grandmother would recognize as food. The point being that you should avoid uh, the kind of processed foods that we now take for granted.
Yeah.
Historians have looked at that and panned it because they pointed out that his grandmother historically probably would have been eating really crazy foods. Like there's this kind of imagination of food as being wholesome and traditional and natural 100 years ago, when in fact, if you look, there were a lot of crazy things that people were eating. They had their own problems with adulteration. So there's a kind of false, nostalgia to draw
Yeah.
on your show's title, a
Totally.
false nostalgia about like what traditional food was. And if you went back 100 years ago and showed them the kind of convenience foods that we have today, a lot of people would be like, "This is great, sign me up." It's amazing because they would see all of the work that would have had to go into it to process it and prepare it before it gets to us. And
Well,
they
yeah.
would see that because they would be aware of all that work.
I'm glad you brought that up. And I don't think Michael Pollan is as influential a figure as he was 10, 15 years ago, honestly, in part because it feels like I don't know, there's been a kind of diffusion of ideas about food that have gone in different directions, but also because of those critiques that are sort of missing from what he's saying, which it is a kind of like, it is a privileged position to be like, you should eat this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think you mentioned the kind of weird sort of pro science and then now anti science attitudes in these kinds of movements. And one of the problems with this concern about chemicals that you have historically is that so you have these periods where the public expresses real anxieties about it. You also have the industries invested in this pushing back. And so you have in the 1970s companies like Monsanto, which is this chemical company. It produces lots of chemicals, some of which are used in food. Um, they call this a kind of toxicity crisis because they're saying Americans are so obsessed about chemicals that they're just kind of being irrational and we need to start lobbying them. And I was really happy in my book to be able to get this image of a Monsanto advertisement in the sort of uh, late 1970s, early 1980s, where it shows a picture of an orange and this fake label on it, and it says, "Mother Nature is lucky her products don't need labels."
That's
Because what
great.
they're trying to argue is that if they had to do an ingredients label for a whole food, it would look scary and chemical, right? And consumers don't get this because, in fact, those scary sounding chemicals are actually really normal, ordinary stuff.
Yeah,
Um,
well, it
this
reminds me of
really,
like the chemtrails sort of conspiracy theory too. That like they're spraying chemicals everywhere. There is a thought, and it's on it's on the internet and elsewhere, and I think it trickles into mainstream politics that everything is chemicals, and there's a sort of idea that chemical equals bad, which doesn't seem like it goes with the science necessarily.
yeah. Eh, You know, 10 years ago, there was this wonderful moment. I used to teach it in my classes where you have this blogger food babe who now is getting all this attention. This is Vani Hari, and she's been pulled into the RFK
What's her
sort of
name?
discussions. Vani Hari, and
Hmm.
she has been blogging called the Food Babe for decades, for at least 15 years now. And she's very much in this kind of Maha. She actually has a thing that if you can't pronounce it, don't eat it, is like this
Right,
famous
right,
line she has.
yes.
Um, and so another woman who is trained in chemistry starts a kind of parody blog called Science Babe. And basically she hands her, she like lays into her saying, look at all of these things, that look like chemicals, but are actually everyday ingredients. And this is sort of anti-science or pseudo-science. And I love looking at this exchange because they're kind of, I would say they were talking past each other, but they actually perfectly feed into each other. They just have a very different payoff of what they want to get. For the
Mm.
science babe, it's very much a story of look at these irrational people. They don't understand science. They're anti-expert. And we just need to trust experts and trust the phrase that is used is like sound science. And a lot of people, I think, are responding to the Maha movement with that kind of anger and skepticism or dismissal, or they wish they could dismiss it and are frustrated. And I have to say, as someone who studies science, I would say that's a really uh, sort of dangerous position because it's not recognizing real concerns about chemicals. And I think what's good about the MAHA movement is that there has been a kind of complacency at the Food and Drug Administration with lots of old concerns. Another image I got in my book that shows this is you have this community called food technologists. In the 1980s, they're really upset with the kind of gap between what experts think is a danger versus what the public does. And at the top of the list of what the experts say is the danger are things like microbial concerns,
Mm.
sort of
Hmm.
bacteria,
Right.
food contamination, because that's what kills people. And the FDA's food budget reflects this. Like 90% of its budget goes towards contamination concerns and the kind of recalls and that kind of food safety because this kills people and it kills people a lot, which is why they don't want to waste a lot of energy on the concern about chemicals. This
Yeah.
idea that there's this hypothetical low level chemical that maybe is contributing to cancer is very hypothetical. And so they treat this as kind of like, you know, rationally, we should be focused on what's definitely killing people, not on this other
Like E.
stuff. And you can see
coli and things like that. Yeah.
exactly, right? And I think the problem with that is that they're not appreciating the public's priorities. Like we can understand that there are these kind of health concerns that are old with contamination. We want the agency to address that, but I think a lot of people rightfully also want us to start looking at all of these weird chemicals that are in our food supply. So I feel like the science babe, when she says, "Oh, this is irrational," it's hard for me to trust her and sort of think that she's not kind of oversimplifying those arguments. On the other hand, the food babe is absolutely not evidence based. It's just in
Yeah.
kind of incredible, right?
Right. That's what's
She's
frustrating about this is that there's sort of like you can see seeds of them being right, each side of this, and being right about certain things. And it makes me think that, and it makes sense, especially like thinking about your book, that food and food politics don't really settle neatly on one side or the other in terms of
no,
our sort of political divisions.
yeah, no, they don't. And there is a kind of meeting point of the right and the left. There was a really fun article earlier this year by a Times reporter who was talking about how she had been a kind of granola person her whole life, and now the kind of crunchy has been taken over by the right. And there's a
Yeah.
kind of meeting point between the sort of the left wing granola back to the earth person who's trying to sort of eat in a more sort of pre-industrial way, and then these sort of right wing trad moms who are kind of trying to like um, become self-sufficient, and they're just taking self-sufficiency to a sort of extreme way of moving
Mm.
away from these kind of pre-processed foods.
I wonder what you think about this. If I could read you this quick quote from an article that was in the Financial Times last week about the MAHA movement, and I thought it kind of corresponded to a lot of what you write about, and I wonder what your reaction to it is. It says it's about RFK, obviously, but it says
Mhm.
Kennedy has derided the present FDA guidelines as a 453-page document that looks like it was written by the food processing industry. He's also asked the FDA to look into killing a provision that allows food companies to decide for themselves whether a new ingredient is generally recognized as safe. Stalwarts of food policy have looked on in amazement at this embrace of anti corporate policies that until now were largely the domain of the left. On some issues, he's completely off the wall, says Marion Nestle, one of the United States' foremost experts on the food industry and its impact on American diets. But then on chronic disease, childhood obesity, he's fantastic. I've never heard anybody at this level of government talk about these issues in this way. It's thrilling. That quote sort of blew my mind, and it seems like it corresponds to a lot of what you're writing about.
Mary Nissel is wonderful, and she and I talked last fall, right after the election, and we're kind of in agreement that this is a kind of weird moment. And I think we both had the same take on RFK, and that for me has crystallized since January. There is a way in which he is in this disruptor mode, and some of that could be great because um, the the loophole that quote describes for the generally recognized as safe rules. So the generally is
Yes.
recognized as safe was started around the same time as the Delaney Clause. And the idea was we're going to have strict rules about food additives, but we're going to recognize that there have been food additives around forever. And so generally recognized as safe was like a grandfather clause. If it's been around forever, it's time tested and therefore it's approved. So we won't revisit all these older stuff. Um, for decades, this was kind of lightly enforced policy, but at least required review by the FDA. If you had something and you wanted to claim that it was one of these generally recognized as safe, you could take it to the FDA. In 1997, the FDA changed that to what some have called like self-GRAS. So generally recognized as safe as GRAS. And self-GRAS meant that now the companies got to decide whether they felt like this was generally recognized as safe, and there
Wow.
was no requirement to report that.
Yeah.
And so effectively, it just detoothed the entire concept of food additive regulation. And there has been a lot of interest before RFK, even in the FDA, to change this. And this is important
Mhm.
because I will say, like, there was an ongoing initiative at the FDA under the Biden administration to look at, post-market assessment of chemicals. And that was partly to address this interest in all of these food additive chemicals that are out there that we haven't been assessing. But I think RFK coming right out and saying this is a mistake and we need to change this. I mean, all of those on the left are saying this is great. Let's do this finally, right? Fix that mistake and get some oversight of this. On the other hand, there are sort of two problems that I see with RFK. One is the whole administration right now is about removing staff, removing regulation, kind of emptying out the entire apparatus of oversight. And so the irony, particularly in this case, the case of these food chemicals, um, those hearings were leading to policy changes. They had staff; those staff got laid off. A lot of the staff looking at those chemicals got laid off, and I don't know if they ever got rehired. But there's a kind of contradiction in saying we're going to be tough on chemical oversight and then removing the people at the FDA who are actually qualified to do this. The other thing is, it came out of it was the testimony by his cousin
Yes.
that when I heard this line from her, it was like, this is what is not working with RFK for the Health and Human Services, but also for the FDA. She said he was a predator,
Mm.
and that's a really strong word to use. But what I understood that to mean in light of this long history that I've told you about diet and health markets is that there really are people out there who are motivated by profit, they're selling you something, and they are about exploiting the vulnerabilities of people to kind of make them feel like they have to buy your product to be realized, to have hope. And this is what the FDA has been fighting historically. Like, I think it has gone overboard and dismissed legitimate health products and legitimate health campaigns. I talk about in my book that initially it sees the concern with fatty foods as being that kind of diet fad, and it kind of says we don't support this, and we're not going to do this, and it changes its mind very quickly as the medical community starts increasingly saying, no, this is important, we need to do this. Eventually the FDA backpedals and starts saying, okay, we're going to allow this, but initially its reality is you're just scaring people needlessly, like
Mm.
all of these other people out there. So I think the FDA has made mistakes on this, but there really are people out there, who are predators, who are out there to sell you the idea that that you have this anxiety, and that buying my product is going to answer that. And RFK has a track record of doing this, and it
Yes.
looks increasingly like many of the policies he's doing in office enable that kind of view. We're going to not actually ban things, but instead, uh, pressure the industry to sort of self-regulate and then put out the information. And of course, putting out the information is one of those ways that people who are trying to sell stuff can say, hey, look, we're empowering you with the information, but we're also leaving the decision and the risks, the choices to you as an individual. And then
I,
meanwhile, they're kind of on the side saying, hey, buy this product, this will solve it.
That's so well said, and I'm glad you identified that irony because it's something that drives me crazy about sort of the conservative approach to health and diet stuff. There's such a contradiction there because it seems like a lot of what they're railing against is caused by privatization and private control of the food supply and they want less regulation. And it seems like in a lot of ways their politics contradict their politics about capitalism, basically contradict what their politics are about what they want from the food supply. And it's sort of like, well, what do you want? Do you want regulation or do you not? Because what your politics generally are about, and I think the Trump administration is and the Republican Party has been about forever, which is about more market control, more private control. That, Democrats are doing that with what we call neoliberalism. But either way, it seems like the end result is we get a food supply that's entirely controlled by uh, profit. And the profit seeking engine is the sort of main driver of our food supply. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I think the kind of clearest example of this, not something I talk about in my book, but it's been getting a lot of attention in food policy circles, is with the school lunch programs right now. On the one hand, you
Yes.
have,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's kind of astonishing. You have RFK, um, sort of head of the agency that's above, the Food and Drug Administration, in charge of the nation's health, saying that the school lunch program is poisoning our kids. This is sort of powerful language coming from an official, to make this claim. On the other hand, part of the reason that the school lunch program has all these processed foods is because we provide no budget for cooking on campuses, like
Right.
zero. And so it's just logistically impossible to deliver the kinds of foods that RFK is saying we need to deliver in the school lunch program unless we radically increase the budgets for that, which of course is, the opposite is happening with the US Department of Agriculture,
Hmm.
and the opposite is happening with government spending on these kinds of programs. So it's sort of creating this anxiety around school lunch programs without actually offering a workable solution.
Yeah, they're saying more privatization and less regulation is going to solve the problems that were caused by more privatization and less regulation, right?
Yeah, yeah, I have. So I've thought a lot about what it is about the Make American Healthy Again movement that, the good of it is I do think, and I was saying this last fall, I had a lot of friends and colleagues who were just really focused on the kind of the negative campaign of RFK on things like vaccines and a lot of well-known tools that public health people are invested in and use. And so they were just like, this is going to be a disaster. And for me, it was at that point, I was thinking, actually, I think you need to listen to their anti-establishment message. You need to be open to the kind of concerns they're expressing. I think a lot of people in public health get locked in to a certain way of framing an issue, and that then prevents them from understanding pushback. Like for years, I've been saying, while I very much think that vaccines are good and healthy, I think people should not be treating anti-vaxxers like dismissively. They need to listen to them. The concerns are real and legitimate, even if vaccines are hugely important. And a mistake is just saying, "Oh, they're crazy," and we need to sort of ignore
Well,
them.
the cultural element blinds people, I think, to the
Yeah.
scientific elements of it for sure.
That said, I think we're in this kind of weird anti-expert and especially anti-expert state moment. And I wrote my book to sort of say, hey, here's the world that these experts made.
Hmm.
It was not a love story about experts. I kind of open and say, I want us to study them and understand they have their biases, they have their politics. They often aren't forthcoming about this. And if anything, I was saying like, hey, activists, study this because if you're going to challenge them, you need to be aware of, sort of their game.
Right.
But I don't want to just throw out these experts. Like they really do know a lot of stuff. I'm like you, I was amazed at all of this backstage work that was being done in our food system. Like I just didn't people who dedicate their lives to issues that were sort of like a footnote to me. And it's just kind of impressive. And to suddenly say, we don't want these experts, ignore them, is sort
Yeah,
of
I
really
agree.
dangerous.
Yep. That's
Um,
that's happening, and it does come with so many contradictions, and it's really hard to argue with a lot of the critiques that people bring up of experts. And I mean, when I think about it, again, back to the U.S. History Survey, when we talk about the progressive era, I mean, the progressives were in many ways a nightmare in terms of what they were about culturally and politically. On the other hand,
yes.
the world that they delivered us into and the things that they instituted as sort of public policy improved the world, and I believe in it. And so, like, I think that's navigating those waters is sort of the territory of the future for liberals and progressives in some way. Because at this point, it feels like the MAHA moms do have a kind of powerful moment that they're driving the ship in some ways.
Yeah, I think this is a kind of a seduction of the information age, that this idea we can all be experts now. There are all these memes out there that criticize, I did my own research.
Yes.
And it's like, no, it's like it's more complicated. You know, being professionally dedicated to a subject gives you a different relationship to it. Sometimes that is problematic. Sometimes that means you're invested uh, in a way that closes your mind to what the public is concerned about. But a lot of times it means that you just see things more clearly, and that individuals, consumers who are busy with lots of different stuff, shouldn't be burdened with that. They should be able to delegate that to these experts who can, ensure the public safety. And I think that's really important.
I do too. Xaq Frohlich, I really appreciate you speaking with me. This was super fun.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Especially the wide-ranging topics we can cover on this.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's a subject. I mean, food politics is just huge, but I think your book is really, really thought-provoking. It's called From Label to Table: Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. Really great to talk with you. Thanks for coming on.
My pleasure.
Well, okay. I think that's going to wrap it up for Nostalgia Trap this week. I want to thank my guest, Xaq Frohlich. Go check out his book. It's called From Label to Table: Regulating Food in America in the Information Age. Mind blowing stuff, and a history that I really appreciate, and I hope you do too. So thanks, Xaq, for joining us on the program. Thank you for listening to our conversation. If you want more Nostalgia Trap stuff and you want to support our show, we deeply appreciate it. This is indie podcasting, so we need your support. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. The link is in the episode description. Subscribers get access to all of our bonus episodes. At this point, those are in the hundreds, along with our regular News Trap updates and our screenshots news feed. Lots of fun stuff to check out there. So we appreciate everyone who is subscribing to the show, and we'll be back with more Nostalgia Trap next week. Thanks, everyone. See ya.